going to be talking to you about one of the campaigns we did to protect mangroves. And this story actually goes back to my childhood. As a kid, I don't know what made me get interested into mangrove, but somehow there was some kind of emotional connect. And when I started working for the World Wildlife Fund in 1981, I just thought that it was a very neglected kind of subject and mangrove needed to be protected. And what was really funny is every time I spoke about mangroves, people used to think I'm talking about mangoes. And, I used to say mangroves and the echo would come mangoes. And I had to explain to people what mangroves were and why they were important and that kind of thing. Now, mangroves are actually very specialized plants. I mean, there are a whole over 40 to 50 different species of mangroves in India. And they grow in the intertidal zone, that means between the high tide line and the low tide line, along the coastline, inside the creeks and estuaries. And in Mumbai, of course, and in Thane, along Thane Creek, Mahim Creek, Malad Creek, you can see mangroves proliferating. In Mumbai, of course, because of the pollution and so on, they look quite degraded. But if you actually see them in an unpolluted environment, they can actually grow up to very big trees. And historically, mangroves were cut and used for making boats and ships. So you can imagine the size that they can grow to. Unfortunately, in the popular mind, and I'm talking now way back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, mangroves were looked upon as wasteland. People thought they were sort of places where there were snakes and mosquitoes and a very unhealthy environment. And the emphasis of the government and decision makers was to cut down the mangroves, reclaim the land, and use the land for what they thought was productive uses, like dumping of garbage, which is a big thing in Mumbai, making buildings, and even sewage treatment plants in Mumbai are located in what used to be mangrove areas. And what the decision makers probably didn't realize at that point of time was that mangroves are actually some of the most productive ecosystems on this planet. They're biologically very, very diverse, they're very rich, and they're very, very productive. And they also perform a huge number of functions. Like any plant or any tree, they absorb oxygen because their roots grow in the water, and they also have roots which come out of the soil upwards. Uh, they hold a huge amount of soil together, and the roots have a unique ability to also absorb pollution and purify the water. And also things like heavy metals can be absorbed by the mangroves. So in terms of pollution control, they're very, very useful species. They also are very important because today we all talk about climate change and how the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere are increasing. And mangroves again are able to sequester, that is, they can absorb more than 8 times more carbon dioxide than any of the rainforests can, for example. So again, from the climate change point of view, mangroves have a very, very important role to play. They can also stop methane emissions. So again, as you know, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. And the fact that they can also reduce methane emissions and absorb that is also very, very important from the climate change perspective. As natural barriers that grow along the coastline, they're very useful for mitigating or reducing the impact of cyclones and tsunamis. And the experience in Orissa when the super cyclone took place and when the tsunami also took place was that areas that had mangroves were actually less damaged than areas that were completely exposed to the weather and the sea. And lastly, but not the least, the mangrove root system and the mangrove ecosystem provides a very rich breeding ground and spawning ground for all kinds of marine life. So fish, crabs, lobsters, etc., all breed within the mangrove roots. So to that extent, the marine biodiversity, the life in the oceans, the livelihood of the fishing community is very closely linked to the health and survival of the mangrove ecosystem. So this is really why mangroves are very, very important. So to get back to my mangrove campaign, in 1983, there was a site visit organized by the Maharashtra government and the collector of Raigad district, officials from the MIDC, the Maharashtra Industries Development Corporation, and about 60 to 70 officers from different companies. We all met in Alibag, and the purpose of that visit was to identify locations where these people could set up their shore-based industries along the coastline. So at 7 o'clock in the morning, we landed up at the jetty at Rewa's Mandwa. I don't know how many of you have been there near Alibag. And there's a very good belt of mangroves growing on the side of the jetty. And I was horrified because the collector just pointed out and said, look at this. There are about 200 acres of wasteland over here. And if you guys like this site, we can clear this rubbish, reclaim the land and give it to you within 6 months. So I was horrified. I was probably as old as you were in those days, and I wasn't very well disciplined. So I got up and I gave the collector a firing in front of 60 people or 70 people. And I gave him a lecture on the importance of mangroves. And I said, how can you even think of calling these wasteland and destroying them? And of course, the collector didn't know how to take it from a 25-year-old kid, not used to 25-year-old kids talking back to him. But he took it. And fortunately, that site was dropped from their potential industrial sites. So that really, I think, was the first and very important step in highlighting the importance of mangroves and protecting mangroves from this kind of destructive industrialization. Then, when we got back to Bombay, I started looking at how one could protect mangroves from a legal perspective. And we have something called the Maharashtra Felling of Trees Act, which is applicable to areas outside the municipal corporation and to non-forest areas. And we realized that if you can get mangroves included as a protected species in that act, then people would not be allowed to cut mangroves without permission. And we wrote to Maharashtra government and suggested this to them. And very surprisingly and very happily, the Maharashtra government agreed to do it. And they added all the mangrove species in Maharashtra to that schedule. And that was really the first step of getting legal protection to mangroves. So that was step number 2. The third thing that happened was again very interesting. The collector and the industrial guys in Raigad finally decided to locate all these industries in Rajapuri Creek, which is where Murud Janjira is. And again there, the creek had very rich mangrove. The Murud Fort, the Murud Palace, the Janjira Fort, all very interesting archaeological and historical monuments. And culturally also that area was very rich because there was an Abyssinian tribe called the Siddhis who were brought in as warriors 300 years ago. And there's a very small thriving community there. So we felt the area needed protection. We again wrote to government and said the site is unsuitable for industrialization. They set up a committee to examine the whole issue. I was put on the committee somehow. And obviously, I was overruled by the majority of the government officers who were on that committee. But I gave a note of dissent. I said I didn't agree with the committee report. We sent that note of dissent to the secretary of the Environment Ministry in Delhi. And after I sent that note to him, I got an appointment to meet him. And I went to meet him 2 weeks later in Delhi. When I walked into his room and introduced myself, before I could say anything, he said, Mr. Goenka, I have read your note of dissent and I agree with every single word you said. So I didn't have to convince him, he was already convinced. And we spent 10 minutes figuring out how the government of India could stop this kind of destruction from happening in Maharashtra. And this whole process led to a notification being issued under the Environment Protection Act saying that no industries can be allowed in this area without special permission from the Environment Ministry. So the Ministry of Environment issued a draft notification. They invited public suggestions and objections. And what we did was, with the help of volunteers, we reached out to college students, to school students, and we got the college students to write their own letters. We got the school kids to get their parents to write letters to the Environment Ministry. And several thousands of letters, postcards, inland letters, etc., were sent to the MOEF saying that this area must be protected. And sure enough, after 2 months, the final notification was issued for Murud Janjira, about a 30-kilometer stretch in Raigad district. So having got that success, I went back to the Environment Ministry and I told them that, look, you guys have done a great job. You'll have protected 30 kilometers of the coastline in India. Why don't we think of doing something for the entire coastline? And the Environment Secretary thought that was a very good idea too. And he called one of his senior officers. He said, listen, Mr. Goenka, please sit down with him and please work out a methodology by which we can actually get something going for the entire coast of India. So that is how the Coastal Regulation Zone notification, the famous CRZ notification, was born. And this was sometime in 88. And please remember, in those days, there was no email, there was no computer, there was no internet. Communication from Bombay to Delhi meant either physically going there yourself or sending letters by post and that kind of thing. Even fax machines were very rare in those days and hardly worked. So these drafts kept going back between Bombay and Delhi. We had a very good team of lawyers with us who worked for us passionately. And again, the ministry was very, very helpful. We got a draft issued in 1988. Unfortunately, at that point of time, there was a lot of pressure not to protect the coastline from different parties who were impacted. So that notification was allowed to lapse. But in 1989, we got the MOEF to reissue the notification. And in February 91, on 19 February 91, we got this Coastal Regulation Zone notification protecting the entire coastline of India. And mangroves were included as ecologically sensitive species, which meant that mangroves could not be touched. They had to be protected. And in fact, there was a buffer zone also described that within 500 meters of the mangroves, certain kinds of activities would again be prohibited. Now, of course, as you all know, destruction still continues even today. In 2004, again with the help of my legal team, we filed a petition in the Bombay High Court saying that mangroves are being destroyed despite the notification. And the High Court uh, actually passed an order on 6th October 2005 protecting mangroves in Maharashtra and giving a lot of stringent guidelines to the Maharashtra government to follow, saying that you have to do this proactively. And if there are complaints about mangrove destruction, you have to appoint a senior officer to respond and deal with all those kind of complaints. So that mechanism is actually in place. In fact, even despite court orders, we still get complaints from citizens, volunteers, people like you who are interested and involved. And we actually follow up on each and every complaint that we get. We do site visits, we take photographs, we send them to government and to the collector's offices and the forest department and so on. And we make sure that action is taken. And the other interesting thing that has happened is because of this High Court order, uh, the forest department set up a separate wing exclusively for the protection of mangroves in Maharashtra. And that mangrove cell is headed by an officer of the rank of additional principal chief conservator of forest, a very senior officer. And his job is nothing else excepting to protect mangroves. So the whole mangrove mechanism has become institutionalized within government, which is a very, very positive thing happening. And what I want to end by saying is that look, when I started off in 81 about my sort of wish to protect mangroves, I never imagined where that dream would lead to. But today, if I look back to what we've done over the past 25 years, I think I'm quite happy with the results we've achieved. And I think the message I want to get you to think about is if you have a dream, if you think something is important in your life, go for it. The environment belongs to all of us. It's not mine, it's not the chief ministers or the prime ministers or to any political party. It belongs to all the citizens of the world. And climate change is impacting all of us even as I speak. And the impact is going to get worse. So the question is, what can you guys do to help out and help yourselves, help your families, help your children, help your grandparents, improve the environment? Don't expect somebody else to do it. I think everybody has a role to play. And the more people who get actively involved, the better it would be for all of us. And one last thought I want to plant in your head. You're all engineers, all people are going to become engineers. See how, as engineers, you can design and build with nature rather than fighting nature. Nature can teach you a lot of things on design and engineering that probably your schools and colleges will never teach you. And climate change is something that has to be factored into engineering now, whether you're building a bridge, building a building, building a flyover, take into account sea level rise, extreme temperatures, extreme climatic conditions. These are all things that have to be designed for and built for. Thank you, everybody.